Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Jung, and on behalf of the ZSR Library Lecture Series Planning Committee, in anticipation of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month in May, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Mark Yamada, who will be speaking today on the topic Ninja in the Dragon's Den, the Regional and Global Dimensions of East Asian Action Cinema. Dr. Yamada is an assistant professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at Wake Forest University. He received his PhD in Japanese literature from the University of California at Berkeley, and Dr. Yamada has published articles on modern Japanese literature and film and has been awarded a Fulbright Fellowship, a scholarship from the Japanese Ministry of Education, and a Foreign Language and Area Studies Fellowship from the United States Department of Education. So without further ado, Dr. Mark Yamada.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again to the ZSR committee for inviting me to come and talk today. I tried to pick a topic that was a little bit sexy, something that would interest people, not just those who have kind of popular interests in East Asia, but those who might have more of an academic interest. But I teach I teach Japanese, but also East Asian culture here at Wake. And I was asked to talk a little bit on the interconnectedness of East Asian culture and the rest of the world, global culture. And I think that we were all reminded of global interconnectedness with the recent earthquake in Japan almost a month ago now. While the epicenter was located off the coast of Japan's largest island, the earthquake was really a global disaster. The resulting tsunami waves that inflicted so much loss of life and destruction on Japanese coastal areas also caused extensive damage to U.S. shorelines as well. In the aftermath, furthermore, economic waves slammed global industries and supply chains, affecting stock markets around the world. The ongoing response to the catastrophe, moreover, has been an international effort. Workers from the U.S., from South Korea, from China, and many other nations have joined forces with Japanese rescuers, while supplies and financial aid arrives from all over the globe. Indeed, the wide-reaching effects of the disaster suggest just how connected we are throughout the world. Well, today I wanted to discuss global interconnectedness by talking about an issue that seems quite trivial after the events of March 11th, that is popular culture. Now, why popular culture? There's something about the visuality, the excitement, indeed the very triviality of pop culture that I think in some ways enables cross-cultural identification. As a case study, I'll examine a 1982 Hong Kong action film titled Ninja in the Dragon's Den. The film, I suggest, represents the development of a shared cultural imaginary in East Asia and also in many ways across the globe. On the surface, however, the film thematizes conflict and difference, drawing attention to the geopolitical tensions that seemingly interfere with regional trends. So, showcasing a dazzling array of techniques, a Japanese ninja and a Chinese kung fu fighter engage in a violent rivalry. Let me show you a quick clip here to give you an idea of what's going on here.
Your small world keeps getting smaller and smaller. Give up?
So for me, the great thing about martial arts films is really no room for subtlety in some ways. I mean, everything is on the surface, the drama, the conflict, everything is on the surface. And so in some ways, it's a little bit more accessible, I think, for audiences. I think also implied in this rivalry is a rivalry between the national traditions that these two fighters represent. The film reflects the continuing importance of nationalism in East Asia. Martial arts cinema, Megan Morris suggests, is blatantly concerned with geopolitical conflict and nation building. However, if the film thematizes conflict, it also seeks to accentuate links among East Asian consumers. Ninja in the Dragon's Den is, after all, a commercial product and is therefore designed to appeal to a wide market. It does this, I suggest, through a melodramatic style that downplays real-world tensions while emphasizing common cultural experiences among audiences throughout the world. Through a discussion of the film, I want to discuss the larger issue of the way pop culture enables the process of regionalization in East Asia, as well as globalization worldwide. Before dealing with the global dimensions of action cinema, let me first discuss the way pop culture in East Asia has helped facilitate a regional cultural identity, a cultural imaginary. First off, what does it mean? What is regionalization? Regionalization implies the breakdown of boundaries among a limited number of states linked by geographical proximity. It suggests the widening, deepening, and speeding up of interconnectedness through a particular part of the world. So, for instance, Japan, mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea constitute the major actors in the region of East Asia. Trends towards regionalization have raised questions about cultural identity, questions about the way that we understand ourselves as part of a nation, as part of a region, as part of a global community. For example, do I define myself as Chinese? Do I define myself as East Asian? Or I define myself as kind of in a global community? Or do these identities overlap in certain ways? Sociologists inform us that a key component in the cultural identification process is the ability to distinguish between similarity and difference, and this seems rather obvious. In other words, we relate to that which we perceive as similar and disassociate from that which we perceive as other or different. I want to discuss the power of pop culture to, in some ways, temper the differences that limit the development of a shared cultural imaginary. In this way, I hope to shed light on the process of regionalization in East Asia. Well, pop culture has generated a shared cultural imaginary among East Asian consumers who feverishly exchange animation, music, films, and even television programming. Among the most popular programs in East Asia are TV dramas. A TV drama is a dramatic miniseries lasting 10 or more episodes, and some of you might be familiar with. This is actually a manga, but one of the most popular series in the last few years is Boys Over Flowers. It tells the story of a working-class girl who struggles to find her way at an elite high school for rich kids, and some of you might be familiar with this manga. The drama is actually based on a manga series, and this is the manga series here. And the manga, you probably heard the word manga before. They're often translated as comics, but in actuality, they're more like graphic novels with often surprisingly complex narrative structures. Boys Over Flowers was first remade as a Taiwanese TV series called Meteor Garden in 2001. It was then adapted into a Japanese series in 2005 before becoming a Korean series in 2009. You can kind of see the similarity between the different series. And there's something about it, even though it's based in Japanese animation, it's not bound to a Japanese cultural experience. There's something about the melodramatic depiction of family relationships, the cliquish school culture that resonate with audiences throughout Asia, demonstrating, I think, the growth of a shared cultural imaginary that transcends borders. Yet if pop culture opens up borders, it can also stoke the flames of nationalism, setting limits on the development of a common cultural identity. The relationship between East Asian nations is still somewhat burdened by historical conflicts. The memory of Japanese colonialism in China, Korea, Taiwan, and other locations during the 1930s and 1940s remains a source of historical trauma and political tension in the region. Likewise, an emphasis on cultural nationalism in the last few decades challenges the construction of a regional imaginary. Political institutions in China, South Korea, and Japan often draw attention to native forms of popular culture in order to bolster a sense of nationalism. For instance, the Korean government has used the recent popularity of Korean film, TV drama, and music, or the Korean Wave, as it's known, as evidence of the superiority of Korean traditions vis-a-vis other East Asian nations. Likewise, the visuality and excitement of pop culture can effectively convey nationalistic ideology. Pop culture, argues Rumi Sakamoto, is an effective means for transmitting propaganda due to its affinity with the simplistic messages of good versus evil and its ability to arouse excitement. A Japanese backlash against the popularity of the Korean wave, of Korean culture in the last decade, suggests an attempt to use popular mediums to stimulate national pride. One example is a surprisingly popular Japanese manga series, Hating the Korean Wave, which was published in 2005. The manga undermines the supposed superiority of Korean culture by representing Korean nationals as opportunistic, hostile, and inferior to Japanese. Without reading the dialogue, you can tell by the very illustrations who is Japanese and who is Korean. And you can kind of see here that this is the Korean character and this is the Japanese character. The animated expressions of Japanese characters strike a distinct contrast to the aggressive and somewhat obstinate air of Korean nationals. And I think this speaks to the power of visual mediums like animation to solidify a sense of national identity, but also a sense of national otherness. The self-other relationship represented in Hating the Korean Wave is designed to stimulate nationalistic fervor, creating challenges to the spread of a shared sense of East Asianness. Yet if the excitement and visuality of pop culture enables the development of nationalism, could it also be used to create a more transnational imaginary? Despite overt themes of conflict, how do popular works like Ninja in the Dragon's Den negotiate the self-other form of identification implied in the discourse of cultural nationalism? I suggest that the very superficiality of pop culture works to its advantage in this regard. The melodramatic narrative of films like Ninja in the Dragon's Den relies on generic Asian values with which a wide spectrum of viewers would be able to relate to. Likewise, the film's cursory treatment of historical conditions allows it to gloss over real-world political tensions, while its exhilarating action sequences provide a less threatening sense of an exotic other. And after I talk about the film in a little more detail, I want to talk about the global implications of the film, but also Asian action and how Asian action has developed transnational audiences in the United States and elsewhere. But let me begin with some background on the film. It was produced with a collaborative effort between the Hong Kong studio Seasonal Films and also Japanese studios and actors. Like much of Hong Kong cinema, it was marketed throughout East Asia, particularly in Japan, in the early 1980s, before becoming a cult hit in the United States during kind of the ninja boom of the 1980s. The story involves a young ninja played by Japanese action star Sanda Hiroyuki. He's pictured here on the right. The ninja seeks to avenge the death of his father by killing those he holds responsible. Accompanied by his dutiful wife, the ninja travels to China to track down the last man he holds responsible, a former ninja named Fukuda who fled Japan many years ago. This is Fukuda. Uncle Fu, as he is known in China, has started his life anew, taking on a protege, a young kung fu fighter played by action star Conan Lee. And Conan Lee is kind of a JV version of Jackie Chan in this time. Conan Lee and Sanda Hiroyuki. After a series of misunderstandings about Uncle Fu's responsibility in the death of the ninja's father, it turns out that they were actually loyal friends, the ninja and the ninja's father and Fukuda. Uncle Fu restores his honor by killing himself, leading to the climactic battle between the ninja and the kung fu fighter, who mistakenly blames the ninja for Fu's death. So that's kind of a roundabout way of talking about it, but that's the plot. And then in the end, the battle ends and in a draw, and the two rivals become friends and eventually brothers. So in this way, I argue the film thematizes the resolution of cultural and political tensions between Japan and China through a depiction of somewhat of a melodramatic family drama. Indeed, melodrama is the basis of its transnational appeal in East Asia. And by melodrama, I mean exaggerated action and emotional intensity. Frenetic action and fierce violence is often used to punctuate strong emotional states, particularly in Asian action cinema. And the source of this action style comes from two important martial arts genres, chambara, which are Japanese sword fighting films. And actually in my film class now we're watching a few different chambaras, and wuxia. I'm going to mispronounce this, I know. I had the Chinese faculty coach me for like 2 hours, and I still couldn't say it right. So just ignore my poor pronunciation. Wuxia, which are Chinese action stories. These two genres developed through transnational interactions between Hong Kong and Japanese film industries. And let me quickly outline these interactions as they speak to kind of the larger issue of transnationalism within the film. So the vast majority of chambara were produced in the 1950s and 1960s. Chambara were widely popular both in Japan but also throughout Asia. Films like Kurosawa Akira's Sanjiro, for instance, played in numerous theaters in Hong Kong during the 1960s. And the popularity of chambara is evident in the way that it influenced the cinematography of the main genre of Chinese cinema of the time, which was wuxia. Wuxia are often described as ancient adventure stories involving martial arts experts with supernatural powers. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon from the year 2000 is probably the most recognizable wuxia film in the United States. And there are many different types and different genres of wuxia, but Ninja in the Dragon's Den seems to emulate one particular style involving a powerful martial arts expert who meets another equally powerful expert, resulting in a fierce confrontation. So we have elements of chambara, we have elements of wuxia, we have kind of Chinese and Japanese coming together here. Though wuxia were produced in mainland China as early as the 1920s, in the 1960s, a new style of wuxia emerged partially in response to the action style of chambara. So in many ways, they developed together. Hong Kong filmmakers studied chambara, and studios hired Japanese directors to aid in the productions of these films and even to direct films at times. Consequently, Chinese action cinema began to incorporate a more quick and rhythmic action style, action cinematography, particularly in Kung Fu cinema. And Kung Fu cinema was the most popular style of new style wuxia. The frenetic fighting style of Kung Fu would actually reignite Japanese action cinema in the 1970s as chambara began to fade somewhat in popularity. And it all began with Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee, in the early 1970s, the Japanese film industry took note of the popularity of Kung Fu, and they even began to incorporate and remake well-known Hong Kong films, and even fashioning a Japanese counterpart to Bruce Lee in the form of Sonny Chiba, who is pictured here and actually plays a minor role in Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill series. He's the samurai figure. So that's Sonny Chiba. So we have, Sonny Chiba is kind of the counterpart to Bruce Lee in Japan. Chiba's 1974 film Street Fighter, critics suggest, is heavily influenced by the choreography, the cinematography of Enter the Dragon. Lee's films influenced Japanese cinema through the mid-1970s until Jackie Chan inaugurated the second coming of Hong Kong in the late 1970s, mixing in kind of a slapstick humor style to martial arts films. So you can see the development of it. And this is where we position Ninja in the Dragon's Den, which is right after the Jackie Chan boom. So you see some of those elements in the film as well. Well, let me move on to this idea of melodrama. The frenetic fighting style that developed in these transnational connections has come to, in some ways, characterize Asian action, this kind of frenetic, quick, rhythmic fighting style. This action style is often used for a melodramatic purpose, to depict the emotions and strongly held values of characters. In particular, combat scenes portray Confucian family values in a manner with which a variety of Asian viewers would identify. Now, Confucianism is a Chinese ethical and philosophical system that spread to Japan and other parts of Asia over 1,000 years ago. Though it has taken on different meanings in Japanese and Korean culture, Confucianism is nevertheless has pretty much turned into a central East Asian value system. In its original form, Confucianism taught the importance of loyalty in the 5 main human relationships, which include master and disciple, the relationship with master and disciple, the relationship between father and son, the relationship between husband and wife, brother and brother, and friend and friend. And these relationships were decided by kind of hierarchical relationships. And loyalty is a main kind of value within these relationships. Well, a melodramatic treatment of Confucian values is a common technique for marketing pop culture in East Asia. Critic Ma Ning argues that Confucian themes play a central role in contemporary Chinese cinema. According to Ki Hong Lee, moreover, Korean cultural industries draw regional audiences by accentuating the value of filial piety in Korean TV dramas. Melodramatic action is an effective means of portraying Confucian values, I suggest, due to its presentation of larger-than-life characters whose sense of loyalty is dramatically highlighted through physical combat. Indeed, melodrama foregrounds value systems that are often naturalized in more realistic forms of media. So in many ways, it brings these values to the surface in a very overt way. Well, larger-than-life action heroes provide archetypal Confucian figures with whom a wide audience can relate. In order to market the film in East Asia, filmmakers sacrifice cultural nuance in favor of a depiction of conventional Confucian ideals. Filmmakers find common ground between the different views of Confucian loyalty in the code of honor of the ninja and the filial piety of the kung fu fighter, so kind of bringing these two together. Although the representation of honor in Japanese action cinema would be vaguely familiar to Chinese audiences, the film further decodes it for the viewer. Just to give you a little bit more background on Chambara, Chambara usually set in Japan's feudal period. This period was characterized by a very rigid caste system, and which was based on a Confucian relationships, these Confucian hierarchies that were designed to maintain order in society. Born into a caste system, the warrior was bound to his lord and expected to serve him to death. Like their Chambara counterparts, protagonists of Chinese action cinema embody the virtues of filial piety, but the nuances are quite different. The values are not presented in the same way. Although unlike Chambara heroes, wuxia protagonists are not typically bound to a lord and often do not come from the aristocratic class. Often loyalty is expressed in the relationship between family members and between master and disciple. So you have two different value systems that are in some ways codified in different ways in these different action genres. Well, the film brings Japanese and Chinese Confucian cinematic conventions into greater uniformity by accentuating the importance of loyalty and family relationships. To heighten the emotional tenor of the narrative, the film treats all 5 of the main relationships of Confucianism, but focuses on the relationship between father and son and brother. The quest for revenge highlights the loyalty of both the ninja and the kung fu fighter. And the ninja story is vaguely familiar to a well-known Japanese historical tale called The 47 Masterless Samurai, which tells of a loyal band of warriors who seek to avenge their fallen lord. The tale was actually remade as a 1962 Chambara film, which would be familiar to Asian audiences. And so Ninja in the Dragon's Den, I argue, downplays the relationship between lord and subject by making the object of the ninja's loyalty the father. The ninja is consumed with hatred for those he blames for his father's death, demonstrating the sense of loyalty. Likewise, the kung fu fighter is fiercely loyal to his surrogate father, Uncle Fu, and vows to avenge his death. Fierce, emotional battle scenes underscore this unwavering sense of duty. The brother-brother relationship, furthermore, emphasizes the importance of loyalty while also providing the means for the Japanese and Chinese action heroes to overcome their rivalry. The ninja and the kung fu fighter, at first enemies, form a friendship when their confrontation ends in a draw. This friendship eventually turns into a brotherhood when the ninja and the kung fu fighter discover that Uncle Fu has given each one of them one side of a Buddhist memento symbolizing their brotherhood. So they realize this at the end of the story, and it's kind of cheesy. They put the thing together, and they realize that they're brothers, right? So this is kind of the resolution of the family drama. In this way, Ninja and the Dragon's Den embeds the Japanese action hero in a general set of Confucian family relationships recognizable to a wider audience, playing up these values through the emotionally heightened themes of revenge and brotherhood. So melodrama plays an important role here. Chinese and Japanese audiences might not be familiar with the nuanced representation of Confucian values in Chambara and Wuxia, respectively, but can nevertheless associate with this general sense of loyalty, to superiors. The self-other conflict between a ninja and a kung fu fighter, between Japan and China to a certain degree, finds resolution through a Confucian family drama that brings the main characters together while at the same time creating a shared cultural imaginary for the East Asian viewer. Now, if the film's melodramatic treatment of Confucian themes allows a wider audience to identify with it, setting the film in somewhat of a stock Asian backdrop downplays real-world tensions. Although Japan and China are placed in conflict with one another, historical friction and political discord is muted by the ancient setting of the film. In addition, blatant historical anachronism suggests the film is not really interested in developing an accurate view of history, let alone a history of the conflict between China and Japan. Rather, it showcases the abstract East Asia of action cinema. I mean, we really get this kind of idea, this kind of Quentin Tarantino view of Asia, which is a very abstract Asia, the Asia, kind of the postmodern Asia of action film. Opening in medieval Japan, the setting for Japanese action films, the scene changes to more of a generic backdrop of traditional Chinese action cinema. In this way, Ninja and the Dragon's Den presents more of a fantasy Japan, which is not as threatening as a geopolitical entity. This technique is similar in some ways to what Kelly Hu describes as global localization. Global localization is a way of marketing goods globally by downplaying their association with a particular national origin, allowing them to appeal to a wider consumer base. So downplaying the connection between media, and you can see this a lot in recent Jackie Chan movies where the setting is just kind of this general kind of global setting. It's not really Asia, it's not really the West, it's kind of just this general kind of global setting. So downplaying a connection to a particular culture tradition in order to kind of sell or market the media, the product worldwide. Another example is in the 1980s, the Japanese electronic industry successfully marketed televisions and VCRs to East Asia by tempering the connection between these goods and the depiction of a Japanese way of life. So consumers were not really buying a Japanese way of life, they were buying just a VCR. This is kind of the idea behind that. In this manner, Ninja and the Dragon's Den neutralizes a threatening sense of cultural difference, turning Japan into somewhat of an abstraction or even a fantasy. At the same time, it is important to note that cultural difference is not entirely eclipsed in the film, but actually accentuated in certain degrees, in certain ways. While the melodramatic portrayal of a Confucian family drama allows East Asian audiences to identify with the film, it creates a sense of sameness, in other words, the exhilaration of exotic ninja action also provides a sense of difference, a sense of the exotic, and also an impetus for regional audiences to see it. So they connect to the film, but at the same time they're also drawn to it by the sense of difference, or the sense of exotic. The film attracts Asian audiences with the promise of fantasy, with the promise of a striking and mysterious protagonist, yet at the same time a protagonist who is also more familiar than maybe a Western hero. In some ways, kind of a familiar sense of difference, if that makes sense, a more familiar sense of difference. So masked, the ninja is an exotic Japanese other, but unmasked, he is a fellow Asian brother. Critic Lisa Jung suggests that consumers in East Asia are attracted to the similar but not quite same aspects of other Asian cultures. Asian consumers identify with the general Asian appearance of actors. And I think that's why dramas are so popular, because there's a sense of difference and otherness. At the same time, there's also a sense of sameness that you can identify with. And even as the sense of not quite sameness stimulates interest. Inundated with pop culture from both America and Japan, Asian consumers, Lung suggests, view these two cultures differently. American culture as a model of Western modernity, and Japanese culture as somewhat of a mirror of modernity within East Asia itself. So different views of difference, of modernity kind of come into play here. The tendency to search out both the familiar and the exotic challenges the view of regionalization and globalization as just the process of creating a homogeneous cultural identity. Transnational identification is not just about finding common cultural ground, but also in pursuing differences. It implies the engagement with a sense of otherness that is nevertheless somewhat familiar and safe, or neutralized to a certain degree. I think politically neutralized in the case of a lot of Japanese culture. Transnational identities, according to Yu Hundreds, are characterized by an orientation, a willingness to engage with the other, an intellectual openness towards divergent cultural experiences, a search for contrasts rather than uniformity. With its treatment of cultural similarities in an exciting and exotic manner, Ninja and the Dragon's Den represents the construction of a regional cultural imaginary within East Asia. Now, I'd like to conclude by looking a little bit beyond East Asia and touch on the transnational connections between Ninja and the Dragon's Den and Western audiences. If Hong Kong serves as a locus for the development of regional trends in East Asian action, it has also served as a gateway through which action and Asian action films have flowed across the globe. Megan Morse describes Hong Kong film as a local cinema with transnational appeal. The global ambitions of Hong Kong cinema began in the 1970s when studios turned their attention to international markets. The trans-regional popularity of Asian action, much like its regional regard, is based on its capacity to negotiate differences by presenting a familiar sense of Asian otherness. Western audiences respond to an exotic, yet nevertheless stereotypical, and therefore safe representation of Asia. Hong Kong films make good global action cinema, Stephen Teo suggests, due in part to the portrayal of an Asia that corresponds with conventional views held by audiences outside the region. So in some ways, the stereotypes are a way, playing up the stereotypes is a way of kind of making connections that way. Nevertheless, Asian action has also built connections between East Asia and audiences in places like urban America. In the 1970s, urban African Americans were the first non-Asian community to embrace martial arts cinema in the United States. In her very interesting book on black culture in the 1970s, Amy Ongiri argues that as white people abandoned the cities, downtown theaters became spaces for people of color. Theater owners screened films that were cheap and less marketable. In other words, imports, and particularly martial arts movies. Urban audiences were drawn to exciting action scenarios involving a hero with whom they could relate to in racial terms. In a recent documentary on the influence of Bruce Lee on global culture, I think it was on the History Channel, it was a very interesting documentary. It talked about Bruce Lee and how he's influenced everything from rap to martial arts, obviously, to other areas of culture. Rapper-turned-actor LL Cool J suggests that he and other fans of Asian action identified more with the non-white protagonist than with the ubiquitous Caucasian hero of action films. Hong Kong studios further cultivated a connection with the black experience by incorporating themes of racial oppression. Lee's 1971 film Fist of Fury, which is set in a British colony in Shanghai in the early 20th century, features Lee as a Chinese national fighting against racial segregation. Through images like this one, obviously the sign, the film draws a connection between a Chinese and an African-American experience with discrimination. So in some ways, I think it's building on these connections that were made in martial arts films. In fact, martial arts played a key role in black activism in the 1970s. According to Warrington Hudlin, film producer and former civil rights leader, the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam were heavily invested in martial arts. One of the reasons for the connection between Asian action and black activism is the use of hand-to-hand combat, which is identified as a fighting form of oppressed classes worldwide. The empty hand, Hudlin suggests, is the weapon that can hide in plain sight. So the martial arts have always been the art of resistance. Indeed, there's an entire filmography, and you can probably name films yourself, that merge black culture and Asian action, including Black Belt Jones from 1974, starring Jim Kelly. Urban blacks, Hudlin suggests, grew up with one foot in Africa and one foot in China. So it's a very interesting kind of idea, this idea of transnational connections with urban audiences. Well, released in the early 1980s, Ninja and the Dragon's Den takes advantage of the transnational connections formed between black culture and Asian action in the 1970s. The film features somewhat of a funk soundtrack, reminiscent of blaxploitation cinema, which is another major kind of action cinema during the 1970s. The opening of the film introduces the ninja using this soundtrack. Let me just show the opening of the film here.
Along the coast, no sound is heard. Then a man takes flight, moves through the night without a word. As the one there, and you can't be sure that it wasn't there. Then let me blow your hair. No, you can't be sure he's there. Listen to the children in the day of the legend of the ninja. They were men of the night, who moved in the night and shared their lives. They were ready to fight, for honor, ready to kill, and they were ready to die. Ready to die, ready to fight, for honor, ready to kill, and they were ready to die. Ready to die.
Okay. So if you didn't catch the lyrics, they are, "Now listen to me, children, and I'll tell you of the legend of the ninja. They were men of the night. They moved in the night and shared their lives. They were ready to fight, shaka ninja. For honor, ready to kill, shaka ninja. And they were ready to die." So indeed, the ninja makes a very compelling figure of resistance, I think, as this opening demonstrates. While the film's use of blaxploitation stylistics to introduce the exotic figures of ninjas and kung fu fighters demonstrates in some ways the global ambitions, the global appeal of Hong Kong cinema. In this way, the film appeals not only to a regional cultural identity in East Asia, but also, in some ways, has trans-regional, even global ambitions. In the years following the release of the film, Hong Kong cinema has continued to take on global dimensions involving collaborations with Hollywood studios, directors, and actors, to the point, I think, that even in some ways, Hong Kong action has almost been naturalized into, if you've seen action films lately, it seems like that kind of frenetic fight style, that kind of wire work has almost been naturalized into much of action cinema in contemporary times. Indeed, Ninja and the Dragon's Den raises questions about the relationship between globalization and regionalization in East Asia and culture. And while I'm still working through this problem of globalization and regionalization and how they work together, I suggest that pop culture, and particularly Asian action, provides important insights into both these trends. Asian action entices viewers with exciting fight sequences between exotic warriors, even as it provides the opportunity to identify with larger-than-life figures whose resistance to oppression and adherence to traditional values is carried out on a grand and widely recognizable scale. If globalization concerns the way we identify with transnational communities, then pop culture is an important part of the identification process. With its excitement, melodrama, and visual appeal, pop culture can accentuate the sameness that brings people together, while at the same time tempering the differences that keep them apart. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Yamada. Now we'll open the floor up for questions.
If you don't have any questions, then we can eat sooner. Yeah, Catherine.
I was wondering how you got interested in this, and if it's related to literature, and also why this period in particular. Is it this the 80s, 70s, and 80s?
Yeah, well, I actually teach a class here. I teach a senior seminar in Japanese and East Asian culture, or Chinese and Japanese, with Chinese and Japanese majors. And we look, the goal of the class is look at this trend towards regionalization within East Asia, which seems to be, an important kind of trend. And so our focus is pop culture. And so that's kind of how I started looking at this film. But I actually was first introduced to this film when I was in Japan in the late 80s. And I was actually, this is like, the ninja boom. And so I was like a little ninja fan. And I was there for summer vacation. And I was looking through the bargain bin at a Tokyo video shop, and I found a beta version actually of this video, and it was in Cantonese with Japanese subtitles, and I didn't really, I couldn't read Japanese, and so I had I took it home. My friends and I were watching it, and we were just really amazed. It's like, this sounds like, it looks like is it a Chinese action film? Is it Japanese? We're kind of just, so that was always kind of interesting to me. But I think the 1980s in particular, this is kind of the height of Japanese kind of global power in many ways. This, the growth of the economic miracle during this time. And so you have the beginnings of these tensions. There's still kind of the tension over colonialism. And so how Japan is marketing its popular culture to the rest of Asia is kind of an important issue. I think it comes up here. Things have changed. This is, 30, 40 years ago. And so definitely, the context has changed, and since then, China has overtaken Japan as the second largest economy in the world. But these tensions still emerge. Even about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a controversy that emerged in relation to textbooks and how the Japanese education system, or certain publishers were publishing, very conservative publishers were publishing textbooks that weren't widely used, but they were providing. They weren't necessarily taking responsibility for some of the atrocities that Japanese soldiers committed. They were kind of whitewashing. And so, there was huge protests in Korea, China. So these issues emerge again and again. And these issues are not ones that are easily resolved. And I think that Japan's kind of incorporation into East Asia hasn't been as smooth in some ways as maybe Germany in Europe. Because there is no kind of European Union, there's no kind of coalition there, and so it's very interesting to see how it's negotiated through pop culture, through cultural exchange, things like that.
So some unresolved issues are played out over and over.
Yeah, and I think this is why this film is so interesting, because it really brings those issues to the front, and you have this drama, and it's very kind of on the surface. You have China versus Japan, but the film works its hardest to also kind of neutralize that tension. And I think using these Confucian values, using this kind of Confucian drama that tries to create a sense of sameness as well. So yeah, it's a very kind of interesting film that way. Yeah. I told my class I'd give them extra credit if they ask a question. Just joking. They just had to come. Rich, go ahead.
With any of these films, is sort of the deconstruction of boundaries, is it problematic at all, like the construction of Orientalism, or like the breaking down of like specific national identities in Asia? Do you see that at all as problematic?
Kind of a depiction of Orientalism?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there is. I think that's in some ways a marketing strategy for Hong Kong film is kind of this auto-orientalizing structure. That in some ways kind of playing up this kind of the Oriental features, right? I talked about how in some ways the stereotypical Asia is easier to receive for maybe a Western audience, and I think that goes for me as well. I mean, when I would go to an Asian action film, I'm expecting to see certain things, and so the stereotypes, that kind of Orientalist thing, in some ways, is part of the marketing strategy of Hong Kong films. So, yeah, in some ways, they're kind of using that, I think, to a certain degree in order to market films. Yeah. Go ahead.
Kind of in relation to that, so we talk about the East Asian stereotypes. They kind of proliferate from the combination of the Chinese culture and Japanese culture. Do you see there being like a reverse negative effect in which Hollywood casts Chinese actors in Japanese roles in movies like Melodrama, which you have Chinese actors playing a very traditional Japanese artisan? So, I guess my question is there kind of a negative reversal in which the Western audience buys into this imaginary Asian sphere of cinema, and then it gets sent back and creates some tension?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely, I think, an issue, and with films like Memoirs of a Geisha and the film you're talking about, where I think most of the lead were Chinese, and I think part of it has to do with the fact that there aren't really any, I don't want to say charismatic Japanese actresses, because there are, but there's not really any globally known Japanese actors like there are. I mean, who are the actresses? I can't remember, but they've been in major films. They've been kind of in globally kind of seen films, and so maybe that's behind that. But I think you have a good point there, is that there is this kind of tendency to the Asia as this kind of this just general kind of Oriental kind of place, right? Where it doesn't really matter. You can look. We can, switch in a Chinese actress, and they serve just as fine as a Japanese actress, things like that. In some ways, I think that novel and that film is also a fantasy of Asia in and of itself. So maybe it's appropriate that they use, because in many ways it's kind of it's a Western author recreating Asia in kind of a fantasy way. So maybe in some ways it's appropriate that they have, although I don't think they intended that. I think it was all about money and marketing the film. I think, is it Ken Watanabe in it? Gong Li's in it. Gong Li is, remind me, is she, he? Is it he or she? She. Gong Li is the...
Gong Li is the actor in Raising Red Lanterns. And
okay.
Yeah.
Gong Li, and then there's another, Michelle... What's her last name? She was in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon.
She's the older lady. Gong Li is not in that movie.
She's not...
The geisha person, the geisha girl is in Crouching Tiger. She's the younger girl.
She's a younger girl, yeah.
In Crouching Tiger, and her name is Zhang Zi.
Yeah. So, it's really kind of interesting. It's an interesting problem, this idea of kind of Orientalism, and in some ways is East Asia a victim? At the same time, there's this auto-Orientalizing kind of function where they're presenting kind of a general East Asia. It has kind of a regionalizing function as well. So it's hard to tell. There's kind of this give and take there a little bit, but it's an interesting problem. I think, is Ken Watanabe in that film? Ken Watanabe was in The Last Samurai, and so he's kind of he's kind of a charismatic Asian actor or Japanese actor. There are very few, and it has something to do with maybe the film industry or something.
And also, I think the fact not a lot of Asian actors and actresses can speak English well enough to appear in Western movies.
Yeah, and so that's part of it as
right.
well. Yeah.
And I was going to say, as Chinese, I think it doesn't offend me to see a Korean playing a Chinese as much as a Westerner, a white Caucasian playing a Chinese.
When do you see that? Have you ever seen that?
It's a movie.
Oh, really?
Like Caucasians, narrowing their eyes and
Richard Gere played a half Japanese guy in a Kurosawa film. But he kind of has squinty eyes anyway, so that's okay. Sorry, I can say that I'm part Asian.
We're not offended as much, but
Yeah.
we do laugh at it. We see Korean because we can tell that person's Korean. We know that person's Korean. Playing a Chinese, we do laugh at it, but we don't get offended as much.
Yeah, and I just wonder if it's just kind of the part of just the global dimension. If you saw Ghost Dog Samurai from years ago, you have I can't remember his name. What's his name, Dan? Forrest Whitaker playing. He's a kind of a samurai figure. He plays like this Bushido character in a very convincing way. And so, I think it's in some ways just kind of maybe a product of just this globalization of East Asian, of action, of martial arts films, so. But interesting question. Yes, sir.
The Japanese samurai films of the 50s and early 60s. Was that a way of Japan dealing with its own legacy of the 30s and 40s, perhaps the way of Bushido, was core about militarism?
Yeah. Yeah, and this is actually a topic that we're talking about in my film class. Dan, you want to field that one? I don't want to put you on the spot. Yeah, I mean, it's in many ways this idea of, the Bushido was this loyalty with one's master. And I think Japanese culture in the post-war period is very tentative to depict this kind of hierarchical relationship with a kind of a lord. I mean, there's this, the emperor, Emperor Hirohito, who, was required to admit that he wasn't divine. And so there's kind of this suspicion towards maybe kind of authority. And so films like Sanjuro, which are about ronin, about these kind of masterless samurai who wander, who don't really have associations, their loyalty, their sense of virtue is expressed often in horizontal relationships with other samurai, other people that they help along the way. And so you definitely see that. It's and also in gangster films as well in the post-war period, you see a lot of this disassociation from some kind of hierarchical relationship. This kind of
Still the boss. Who's the villains?
What's that?
There's still loyalty to the boss.
There is to a certain extent, but oftentimes you have betrayals by the bosses betraying those below them. You'll have people who kind of leave their Yakuza group and kind of wander. So these relations are kind of called into question a little bit in the post-war period. I think it does have something to do with this idea of kind of the war and this anxiety towards maybe authority of, that kind of thing, and more, exercising your agency in these kind of horizontal relationships. But that's a interesting way of looking at it. Yeah.
Well, can I ask if I'm an East Asian, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, and I see these films, and I feel the regionalization, and I feel a part of the region.
Yeah.
What's the next step? Are there websites where people getting together and talking about these films? I mean, where is it? It's intriguing to think about the imagined community, but I guess where else does it present itself?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it, of course, is online. And an interesting way you see it now is the trading of TV programs, right? I mean, you have, and fan subs. So you'll have a drama that's it airs in Japan, and then you'll get I don't know if it's, maybe someone in Korea who speaks Japanese will translate it, put subtitles on it, and then upload it. And so you'll have that kind of connection where people are kind of corresponding that way. Yeah, I mean, in the trading of film, animation to a certain degree. At the same time, I mean, there's still it seems to be a lot of tension. There's a lot of, what's the term they call it? Cyber nationalism or something? I can't remember. But, for example, when, who's the Korean speed skater, or the American-Japanese speed skater? Apollo Ono, when he had this big beef with Korea, right? And I think a lot of Koreans got online and, they crashed the U.S. speed skating site or something like that. So you have a lot of that, especially located a lot in Korea. There's a lot of kind of, I don't know if the term is right, does anybody know the term cyber or something like that? But there's a lot of that located in Korea. So you have a lot of, it's interesting. I mean, you have these protests, you have kind of animosity, but you also have in some ways the sharing of culture through, things like the internet, things like that. So I don't know if there's any necessarily regional East Asian kind of help groups or anything, but yeah, I think it's more through that kind of trading of culture. Another thing that's kind of interesting is they have what's known as cultural pilgrimages, which is something that's really big. But if you watch it, for example, people from Taiwan will often go to Japan to see the locations of their famous of the Japanese dramas. So the famous locations, kind of like somebody coming to the United States and seeing where a film takes place in New York or something, see where it's actually filmed. You'll have a lot of people from East Asia, particularly in the 80s and 90s, who would come, and travel agencies would actually have tours where they would say, a 3-day tour of Tokyo will stop at, this site from this drama, this site from this drama, this site from this. So that's really popular as well. So things like that, cultural pilgrimage. Even now, I mean, I think the tourist industry with Korea and Taiwan and Hong Kong and China is still really big, despite the problems that are going on in Japan. I think there's still people coming to Japan. So, I mean, it's a good question to ask. I mean, how, this kind of imagined community is sustained, how it's, yeah. So.
Well, I'm Christian Morris and co-chair of the Library Lecture Series, and we'd like to thank Dr. Yamada again for speaking.